Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. In the courtroom, adults understood exactly what that meant. The lawyers did. The judge did. The reporters writing their headlines did. But the person standing at the center of the case did not. He was a child. And like many juveniles sentenced in America during the 1990s, he had no real understanding that life meant forever. One of the most well-known real cases behind this story is Lionel Tate. In 1999, Tate was just 12 years old when he was convicted of a violent crime in Florida. At an age when most kids were worrying about school, video games, and friends, he was placed in an adult courtroom and judged under adult laws. Prosecutors chose to try him as an adult, a legal option that existed at the time. That single decision changed everything. Inside the courtroom, Tate was physically small, sitting among adults who spoke in legal language he could barely follow. The trial moved forward using rules designed for grown men, not children. When the verdict came back guilty, the law left no flexibility. The sentence was mandatory. Life without parole. No second chance. No review later in life. No possibility of ever walking free. What made the case especially disturbing was what experts later explained. Children do not process consequences the way adults do. At 12 years old, the human brain is still developing the ability to understand long-term outcomes. To a child, life is an abstract idea. It doesn't feel permanent. It doesn't feel real. For Tate, the sentence likely sounded like a long punishment, not a death sentence behind bars. At the time, America was in the middle of a moral panic over juvenile crime. Politicians warned of super predators. Laws were rewritten to be tougher, faster, and more punitive. Juveniles were increasingly pushed into adult courts, where judges often had no discretion to consider age, background, or maturity. In that climate, Tate's sentence was legally allowed, even encouraged. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Many people were shocked to learn that a child could receive the same punishment as the most dangerous adult offenders in the country. Others believed the severity of the crime justified the sentence, arguing that accountability mattered more than age. The nation became divided, not just over one case, but over a much larger question. Can a child truly understand a sentence that lasts longer than their entire life so far? For Tate, prison life began immediately. He was sent into a system built for adults, with rules, routines, and consequences that assumed full emotional maturity. There was no roadmap for rehabilitation, no timeline for review. The system treated his future as already decided. The doors closed and childhood ended permanently. It is not just about one boy or one courtroom. It is about a moment in American history when fear outweighed understanding and punishment replaced possibility. It is about how a single sentence, spoken in minutes, can erase an entire lifetime of potential. And it raises the question that would later reach the highest courts in the country. If a child cannot understand what life truly means, should the law still make it final? This was only the beginning. Life inside prison did not begin with violence or chaos. It began with confusion. For juveniles sentenced to life without parole in the United States, the first years behind bars were often the hardest, not because they understood what was happening, but because they didn't. Many entered prison believing, in some vague way, that things might still change, that someone would eventually realize they were too young, that a mistake had been made, that life could not really mean forever. In cases like Lionel Tate, the transition was immediate and unforgiving. Juveniles tried as adults were placed into an adult prison system that made no distinction for age or development. The routines were rigid. The rules were absolute. There was no special path for growth, no built-in review process, and no guarantee that anyone would ever look at the case again. The system assumed finality from the start. Experts later explained that adolescents experience time differently than adults. A year feels endless to a child. 5 years feels unimaginable. For a teenager or preteen, the concept of spending decades behind bars is not something the mind can fully grasp. Early on, many juvenile lifers struggled with basic emotional survival. coping with fear, isolation, and the realization that their peers were growing up freely while they remained locked in place. Prison life itself reinforced that reality. Days were repetitive and stripped of choice. Education was limited. Contact with family became rare. Over time, the world outside moved on. New laws were passed. Technology advanced. Generations changed. Inside prison, everything stayed the same. For juvenile lifers, adolescence and early adulthood disappeared behind concrete walls, replaced by routines designed for adult inmates. As years passed, public awareness began to shift. Advocacy groups, psychologists, and legal scholars started drawing attention to the growing number of people serving life sentences for crimes committed as children. Research in neuroscience showed that the parts of the brain responsible for impulse control, judgment, and long-term planning are among the last to develop, often not fully formed until the mid-20s. These findings directly challenged the logic behind sentencing children to permanent punishment. Courtrooms slowly began to change. Defense attorneys argued that life without parole sentences for juveniles were not just harsh, but fundamentally unjust. They pointed out that the justice system was punishing children for decisions made with undeveloped minds, then denying them any chance to demonstrate growth or rehabilitation. These arguments were no longer emotional appeals, they were backed by science. For those already serving life sentences, however, change came slowly. Appeals took years. Some were denied repeatedly. Others never reached a courtroom at all. Many juvenile lifers entered adulthood believing their fate was sealed. Education programs, self-improvement, and rehabilitation became acts of personal survival rather than paths to freedom. Without parole eligibility, good behavior offered no reward beyond personal dignity. Families continued to wait. Parents aged. Siblings grew up. Relationships were tested by distance and time. Some families fought tirelessly for reform, while others quietly endured the reality that their loved ones might never come home. The emotional weight of these sentences extended far beyond prison walls, affecting generations. The years where punishment stretched endlessly forward, and hope became fragile. It shows how a sentence delivered to a child does not freeze time, but instead forces that child to grow up entirely within the prison system. And it sets the stage for the legal and moral reckoning that was still to come, when the country would finally be forced to ask whether justice, without the possibility of change, is justice at all. The reckoning did not come quickly. For years, juvenile lifers remained invisible, growing older inside a system that had already decided their future. But slowly, quietly, the question that once shocked the public began to reach the highest levels of the American justice system. Should a child ever be sentenced to die in prison? By the late 2000s and early 2010s, science could no longer be ignored. Brain imaging and long-term studies confirmed what psychologists had argued for decades. Children are fundamentally different from adults. They are more impulsive, more susceptible to pressure, and far more capable of change. Most importantly, they do not fully understand permanent consequences. The idea of forever is something the adult mind struggles with, let alone a child's. These findings began to reshape the law. One by one, juvenile sentencing cases reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In landmark rulings, the court declared that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles violated the Constitution. The justices acknowledged something the system had long denied. Children cannot be judged by the same standards as adults. While the rulings did not guarantee release, they required courts to consider age, maturity, and the possibility of rehabilitation before imposing the harshest punishments. For people like Lionel Tate, these decisions reopened doors that had been sealed for years. Juvenile lifers across the country became eligible for resentencing hearings or parole reviews. Many walked into courtrooms for the first time as adults, facing judges who were now required to consider who they had become, not just who they were as children. These hearings were emotional and complex. Prosecutors revisited old cases. Victims' families relived painful memories. Judges weighed accountability against growth. Some sentences were reduced. Others remained unchanged. But for the first time, the law recognized that change was possible, and that possibility mattered. Beyond individual cases, the impact was national. States rewrote sentencing laws. Mandatory life without parole for juveniles was eliminated in many jurisdictions. Parole systems were expanded. Courts were instructed to treat youth as a critical factor, not an inconvenience. The United States, once an international outlier in juvenile sentencing, began moving closer to global human rights standards. Yet the debate did not end. Some argued that no amount of growth could erase the harm done by violent crimes. Others insisted that redemption should never be off the table for children. Communities wrestled with difficult questions about justice, forgiveness, and safety. There were no easy answers, only a growing understanding that punishment without hope carries its own moral cost. A sentence given to a child is never just about the crime. It is about who that child might become. The phrase life without parole once sounded final, unquestionable, and absolute. Today, it carries a weight that forces courts, lawmakers, and society to pause and reflect. Sentenced to life without understanding what it meant is not just a story about prison. It is a story about growth, responsibility, and the limits of punishment. It is about a nation learning, slowly, that justice must leave room for humanity, especially when the person standing in front of the court is still a child.